Historical thinking is holistic, but often when we assess our students' ability to think historically, we break it into small and more manageable pieces. Because the real test of historical thinking happens in the real world, or as the great John Green might say, it happens on first dates and job interviews and such. Because of that, we should shift the way that we assess students' knowledge and aptitude in historical thinking to more holistic approaches. Hi, my name is Pete Lapré, and I am a teacher in the New York City public school system. For the past 12 years, I've taught at Park East High School, a small school in East Harlem. And in that time, I've been fortunate enough to work on a number of projects, writing curricula or giving feedback to cultural institutions that had me trying to figure out how to best assess historical thinking and how to best teach it. Also, I was a softball coach for 8 seasons, which maybe seems like it doesn't matter, but I'll show you in a little bit. Our goal for today is to look at assessing historical thinking in 3 ways. The first is one of celebration, to think about how far the field has come. The second is to examine now in 2020 some of the limitations that exist. And lastly, a call to action for all of you and myself to make historical thinking more holistic. So first, celebration. We're here. We're talking about historical thinking. There are other presenters talking about it. This is a big deal. Really, the field is relatively new. It really began in large part with Sam Weinberg and the Stanford History Education Group. And since then, in the past 20 years, we have seen a proliferation of a focus on historical thinking. We have a consensus of the terms, the practices, the methodologies. We have banks and banks of assessments that exist, incredible resources that a teacher can access online. And we have the fact that historical thinking has made its way into the standards of so many states. In particular, my state, New York, has made it central to its standards and to its testing in a way that has allowed me as a teacher and historical thinking nerd to really make it the centerpiece of my class. Weinberg, originally writing about it in his book, which called Historical Thinking an Unnatural Act, said, historical thinking in its deepest forms is neither a natural process nor something that springs automatically from psychological development. Its achievement actually goes against the grain of how we ordinarily think. One of the reasons why is it's much easier to learn names, dates, and stories than it is to change the basic mental structures that we use to grasp the meaning of the past. This, I think, he didn't use this term. I think what Weinberg was saying is that it is holistic. It is how we go about viewing the world and history. Right after that, he goes on to talk about how in a world that has Disney and MTV and those types of things, that it's even more unnatural. In 2001, little could he predict the state of the world today and social media and such, which I think, as he's since written about, poses an even greater problem. 2, let's talk about the limitations of what currently happens. And again, there is so much to celebrate, but there are some issues. Currently, historical thinking is most often assessed in parts. I'm going to use the term elements. One of my favorite pedagogies is that of David Perkins in his book, Making Learning Home. And he uses the term element to describe all of it. Before I get to that, though, I want to bring up that softball thing. So when I first started coaching softball, my school didn't have a team. And in New York City, we don't have much space, so we didn't even really have a practice field. And all of the young women assured me that they knew how to play, that they were great, all that. And then came the first day of tryouts. I and my co-coaches quickly realized that they really did not have a basic understanding of the game. So we worked on the fundamentals, right? Just throwing, breaking down the elements of the swing, knowing what base to throw to. We worked on all of the individual elements. And then came the game situation. I don't remember exactly what the score was. I thought about looking it up for this talk, but I don't know if I want to relive that memory. But we got blown out, mercy ruled in the first 4 innings. We had girls who didn't know what base to throw. We had, over the course of the career, we've had a couple of students who ran the bases in the wrong direction. I bring this up because what we did was to teach the elements. It should have been enough, but when it came time to put it all together, they struggled. My fear is that that is what we're doing when we teach and assess historical thinking. Perkins called this problem Elementitis, the disease of learning the elements of things. He wrote, the problem is that the elements don't make much sense in the absence of the whole game. And the whole game usually only shows up much later. We have precision, and we need precision. When we're looking at sourcing, there is a methodology. We need to make sure that students are doing that in the right steps. But that precision that aids us in assessing students isn't necessarily what they'll face in the real world. When I was designing assessments and tools for the Department of Education, we had a curriculum called Passport to Social Studies. And in it, I was responsible for designing all these historical thinking tools. And so I started thinking pretty deeply and looking at the research on what it meant to source. And as I started putting together the sourcing tool, well, I wrote in contextualization. And then when I was working on the contextualization tool, well, you can't really do that without sourcing. And in this effort to disaggregate, I became really frustrated. And that's when I realized that, yes, we need to teach these things in isolation, in steps, but that ultimately the whole progress must come together. This brings me to the third point. We must endeavor to make historical thinking more holistic, and therefore our assessments must be more holistic. Perkins referred to this as playing the whole game. That's why I like this softball analogy. My players could only play the whole game if we had practice in game-like situations, if we had created the experience of the game. Instead, they got baptism by fire. So, how do we do this? Well, this is not to say we should throw everything out. This is not to say that it's a problem that currently most assessments do disaggregate. Rather, this is to say that we need to make sure that we go to a next step. Again, to play the whole game, to engage students in real tasks that historians might consider, well, that sounds like quite a lot. I don't have time, and I agree. These things can get real big real fast. And some of my favorite examples of holistic assessments of historical thinking are big. One place to look is the National History Day competition. They have several different long-term research projects, one of which, my favorite, is called the exhibition. It's really a curation of a museum exhibit. And that can be a very long process. But I think there are ways of adapting those materials which are pretty turnkey. You can find them and make them your own, of adapting those materials to shorter format use. Another part that comes up in the research is this idea of a cognitive apprenticeship, that we should constantly engage the way that students think. One of the researchers who specifically assesses historical thinking is Bruce Van Sledwright. And he argues that one acquires this sort of historical thinking or cognition by participating in a community of practice that is designed to gradually sharpen cognitive capability. Strategic knowledge involves possessing and deploying domain-specific, meaning historical thinking, vocabulary and processes, for posing and answering rich historical questions that result in deeper understandings of the past. In other words, this means doing history, engaging in those cognitive efforts, searching out evidence, assessing the sources for what they may offer, making sense of the perspectives and the sources of the authors, judging an author's reliability, and making reputable claims. Note the active nature of those verbs. These are his italicized words. If we are to assess students' ability, it cannot happen in a vacuum. To do these things for real, they need to be part of a larger project. So, my challenge to you all is the challenge that I'm taking up myself, which is how do we create more meaningful tasks in our classroom settings? Recently, I had the opportunity to work with an incredible historian designing lessons about the life of great American Pauli Murray. And it could have gone in many, many different directions, but we did a 2-day lesson, which ultimately isn't that much of an ask. And in this 2-day lesson, we asked students to consider a question that required them to do all of the historical thinking skills in a meaningful way, to source and contextualize. We asked them, what pronouns should we use when referring to Pauli Murray? As somebody who maybe by the present standard might have identified as a member of the LGBTQ community, and as somebody who did not have that language in their life, there is a need to research, to look into the sources, to consider the time and place in which they were created, to contextualize, to empathize historically. We can infuse in our classes more of these tasks that ask students to play the whole game, and maybe, hopefully, make that unnatural act of historical thinking a little bit more natural for our students. Again, I recognize that this is not easy, and I recognize that it's projecting into an unknown future, saying that we have achieved a great moment in the field of historical thinking that is so present in so many ways. And I ask us to all consider, what's one moment in our curriculum right now where we might make it a little bit bigger and a little bit more holistic? Again, my name is Pete Lapré, and I thank you all for considering this. I am a historical thinking nerd, and I always love thinking through this. So please feel free to reach out if you would like to, or you like to kick some ideas around. You can follow me on Twitter at thinkinhistory, and you can email me at plapre@schools.nyc.gov. Thank you.